A policeman attacks Dina Norris, unaware of who her father is. But when Chuck Norris shows up, the situation changes in an instant. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The school day had been exhausting. Dina Norris stepped out of the tall gray building, adjusting the strap of her backpack with a sigh. The weight of textbooks and assignments pressed down on her shoulders, but it wasn't just the physical burden that made her feel drained. The day had been long, filled with tests, lectures, and the kind of mindless social interactions she never had the patience for. She just wanted to go home, make herself a cup of hot tea, and disappear into the comfort of her room. The sun had already begun its descent, painting the sky with deep oranges and purples. The air was crisp, carrying the lingering scent of rain from an earlier shower. Dina walked along the sidewalk, her sneakers occasionally splashing into shallow puddles that reflected the city's glowing lights. The streets weren't empty, but they weren't bustling either. A few people walked hurriedly toward the subway, some engaged in conversation, others lost in their own worlds. She preferred this quieter route home. It was a little more secluded than the main roads, but it cut down the travel time significantly. Besides, she had walked this way dozens of times before. The small shops that lined the street were beginning to close, their neon signs flickering as the owners locked up for the night. A distant siren echoed somewhere in the city, barely noticeable beneath the hum of passing cars. Despite the exhaustion, she felt a rare sense of calm. As she walked, she adjusted the volume of her music, letting the familiar rhythm drown out the city's noise. It was her small escape, a way to detach from everything around her. She hummed along absent-mindedly, her mind drifting to the weekend. Maybe she would sleep in. Maybe watch that movie her friend recommended. Maybe... The sudden sound of an engine revving behind her pulled her out of her thoughts. She frowned slightly, but didn't turn around. Probably just another car passing by. The engine didn't fade. Instead, it slowed down. Her heart gave an uneasy thud. The headlights cast long, stretching shadows ahead of her, swallowing up the sidewalk in a bright glow. Then, with a sharp screech of tires, the car came to a sudden halt directly in her path. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The doors swung open. Out stepped a man in a neatly pressed police uniform. He wasn't in a hurry. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. His boots thudded heavily against the pavement, echoing in the quiet street. He adjusted the belt at his waist, where a gun and a pair of handcuffs gleamed under the streetlights. Dina took a step back instinctively. The officer was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that was almost suffocating. The streetlights cast harsh shadows over his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the cold glint in his eyes. There was something about him that felt wrong. Her stomach twisted. She had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for a cop to stop her. Yet, as he stepped closer, blocking her path completely, she felt a wave of unease ripple through her body. Her pulse quickened. Something told her this wouldn't be a routine stop. Dina's breath hitched as the officer stood before her, his figure casting a long shadow in the dim glow of the streetlights. The eerie silence that stretched between them was suffocating. Though the city was never truly quiet, everything around them seemed muted. Distant honks, murmuring voices from a nearby alley, the occasional gust of wind rustling fallen leaves. None of it mattered. All she could focus on was the man before her. He was studying her, not in the way a concerned officer might assess a situation, but in a way that made her skin crawl. His eyes dragged over her, analyzing, searching for something. His presence alone was unsettling, yet there was something far worse lurking beneath his gaze, something that felt like pure, unfiltered condescension. Dina didn't move. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay rooted in place. Running wasn't an option. Running would make her look guilty, and she had done nothing wrong. The officer shifted slightly, just enough for his gun to catch the light. Her heart pounded harder. Without a word, he stepped closer. Dina instinctively took a step back, her sneakers scuffing against the pavement. The movement was barely noticeable, but it was enough to make his lips curl into a smirk, a slow, calculated smirk that made her stomach twist with unease. He was enjoying this. She didn't know what he wanted, but it was clear he wasn't here to simply ask for directions. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was even, but there was a distinct edge to it, a kind of rehearsed authority that made it clear he expected to be obeyed. He demanded her identification, his tone making it sound less like a request and more like a command. Dina hesitated. She knew her rights. She wasn't doing anything suspicious, and there was no reason for him to stop her. But she also knew that standing up to a cop, especially one who already looked at her like she was a problem, could escalate things quickly. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she slowly reached for her bag. Her hands were steady, but inside, her nerves were unraveling. She wasn't sure if he could see it, the way her chest rose just a bit too fast, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she unzipped the front pocket. She retrieved her school ID and extended it toward him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he stared at it with open disdain, then at her. Seconds stretched, and then, with a sudden, almost lazy movement, he swiped the card from her hand. Dina flinched at the unexpected aggression but didn't say anything. She simply watched as he held the small plastic card between his fingers, turning it over as if inspecting it for hidden details. And then he laughed. Not a loud laugh, not even an amused one. It was quiet, mocking, dripping with something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Still holding the ID, he glanced at her again, and this time there was no need for words. The way he looked at her made it clear. He had already decided who she was, and it wasn't good. She wanted to snatch her ID back, to tell him to give it to her and let her go, but she forced herself to stay silent. Then, without warning, he flicked the card onto the ground. The plastic landed with a small but distinct clack against the concrete. Dina stared at it. Her fingers curled into fists. This wasn't about checking her identity. This was a game. And he was waiting to see if she would play along. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, she bent down to pick it up. But before she could reach it, his boot slammed down onto the card. She sucked in a sharp breath. Her body went rigid as she stared at the polished black leather that now covered her ID. She could feel her pulse in her ears, loud and relentless. She knew what was happening. He was asserting power, showing her that this wasn't about the law or protocol. This was about control, and she was the target. Dina forced herself to look up. His smirk had widened. She clenched her jaw, forcing down the bubbling frustration. If she reacted, he would win. That much was obvious. Slowly, carefully, she straightened back up. A flicker of disappointment flashed across his face. He had expected her to snap, to yell, to make this easier for him. But she wouldn't. Not yet. His smirk faltered for just a second before he took another step forward. Now, he was too close. Close enough that she could smell the faint trace of aftershave beneath the scent of leather and metal. close enough that her skin prickled with the wrongness of it all. Then, without breaking eye contact, he lifted his boot just enough to kick the ID away. It skidded across the pavement, coming to a stop several feet behind her. Dina's breath caught. Her nails dug into her palms. He was waiting to see what she would do next. And for the first time that night, true anger flared in her chest. But before she could react, his hand was on her shoulder, a grip that wasn't painful, but firm enough to make her freeze. Her mind screamed at her to push him away, to do something, anything. But she knew that would only make things worse. Then the grip tightened. Not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her who had the advantage. The officer leaned in slightly, and that was when the first real wave of fear hit. It wasn't the kind of fear that made her want to run. It was the kind that made her realize she couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. Her throat tightened. The street was empty. There were no witnesses. No one would see what happened next. She had to think. She had to stay calm, even as his fingers dug into her shoulder, even as her ID sat abandoned behind her, even as she realized he wasn't done yet. Dina felt the pressure on her shoulder intensify. The officer's fingers dug into her skin, not yet hard enough to bruise, but enough to send a message. She wasn't in control. He was. A flicker of defiance surged in her chest, but she pushed it down. She had to be smart. One wrong move, and this could escalate further than it already had. Her instincts screamed at her to pull away, to put distance between them, but she knew better. Any sudden movement would give him the excuse he was looking for. She focused on keeping her breathing even. The street was still empty. The city's usual background noise, the hum of traffic, distant sirens, faint voices, seemed muted, as if the world had momentarily paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer didn't speak. He didn't need to. The smirk on his face said enough. He enjoyed this, the power, the intimidation, the control. Then, without warning, his grip shifted. Dina barely had time to react before he yanked her backward. She stumbled, her body jolting as she struggled to regain her balance. Her sneakers scraped against the pavement, but before she could fully steady herself, he shoved her again, this time harder. The impact sent her colliding with the brick wall behind her. Pain shot through her shoulder and down her spine. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she instinctively raised her hands to push away from the rough surface. She barely had a second to recover before his hand was on her again. This time, he grabbed her by the wrist, twisting her arm behind her back in a single, practiced motion. A sharp jolt of pain flared through her shoulder. She gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out. She knew what this was, a display, a warning. He wanted her to struggle. He wanted her to resist. Because the moment she did, she would give him an excuse to do worse. She refused to give him that satisfaction. But her silence only seemed to fuel him. He wrenched her arm higher. The pressure on her shoulder became unbearable, sending another wave of pain down her spine. Her knees buckled slightly, but she forced herself to stay upright. Then came the next shove. Her feet left the ground for a brief second before she crashed onto the pavement. A burning sting shot through her legs as her knees scraped against the rough asphalt. Her palms instinctively caught her fall, but the impact sent a jarring pain up her arms. For a brief moment, everything went still. Dina inhaled shakily, her mind racing. She could feel the warmth of fresh scrapes on her skin, the dull throbbing in her limbs. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing realization of how helpless she was in that moment. She could hear his footsteps circling her, slow and deliberate, a predator sizing up his prey. Then a heavy boot pressed against her back, pinning her down. She went rigid. The weight wasn't unbearable, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that she was trapped. Enough to remind her that he could do whatever he wanted, and no one was here to stop him. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't afford to break. Not now. The boot lifted, but before she could react, fingers tangled into the fabric of her jacket. She was hauled up onto her feet, her body jerking violently from the force. The sudden movement made her vision blur for a second, and she barely managed to steady herself before another push sent her stumbling forward. A firm grip locked around the back of her neck. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was personal. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment, forcing herself to think. The street was empty. There were no witnesses, no one to see what was happening. And if no one saw, there would be no consequences. For him. But for her? Another harsh tug on her arm brought her back to reality. He was moving her, steering her toward his patrol car. No. Panic surged through her chest. She couldn't let this happen. She planted her feet firmly on the ground, resisting his pull. His grip tightened. He yanked harder. A sharp pain shot through her wrist, but she didn't move. She wouldn't go with him. She couldn't. She didn't know where this was headed, but she knew one thing for certain. If she got into that car, she wouldn't be getting out. She twisted sharply, trying to break free from his hold. His grip slipped for a fraction of a second, just long enough for her to yank her arm back. She staggered backward, her breathing ragged. His expression darkened. For the first time, his smirk disappeared. And then, just as quickly, his anger flashed. She saw it in the way his eyes narrowed, in the way his muscles tensed. She had made a mistake. Before she could react, he lunged. This time there was no restraint. His hands gripped her arms with bruising force. She barely had time to struggle before he spun her around and shoved her forward. Her stomach slammed into the hood of the patrol car. The cold metal bit into her skin. She tried to push herself up, but his hand pressed between her shoulder blades, forcing her down. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She was trapped. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. Then she remembered. Her phone, still in her pocket. Her fingers twitched. Could she reach it? Carefully, she shifted her weight. The movement was subtle, just enough to slide her hand toward her pocket. Her fingertips brushed against the smooth surface of the screen. Almost. Then the pressure on her back disappeared. A brief moment of relief, a brief moment where she thought, maybe he's done. She was wrong. The world tilted violently as he grabbed her by the shoulders and spun her around. Then came the final shove. She lost her footing completely. Her back hit the ground with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. She gasped, her vision blurring for a split second. Above her, the officer loomed. And for the first time that night, real fear sank in. He was out of control now. He didn't care about consequences anymore. He only cared about one thing: dominance. Her hands twitched. Her fingers closed around her phone. She gripped it tight, ignoring the pain in her bruised limbs. And then, with one last desperate act, she pressed the call button. The screen lit up. A name appeared. Her last hope. Her voice was weak, broken, but she managed to speak. And, on the other end of the line, someone answered. Dina lay on the ground, her breath ragged, her body aching from the rough treatment she had endured. The cold asphalt beneath her felt solid, unmoving, but her world had shifted into chaos. Her fingers clenched tightly around her phone, the screen casting a faint glow against her palm. The call had gone through. She had spoken. and now there was only silence on the other end. The officer above her didn't notice. His heavy boot pressed against her ribs, pinning her down. His eyes gleamed with unchecked arrogance, a predator savoring his dominance over his prey. He had won, or so he thought. The moment stretched, thick with anticipation. Then the atmosphere changed. A shift so subtle, so profound, it was almost imperceptible at first. But Dina felt it in the air. Something had altered. The weight of the officer's presence, which had seemed absolute, was suddenly challenged by something greater. A sound cut through the quiet. Not the distant wail of sirens, not the hum of traffic, but footsteps, deliberate, measured, unhurried, heavy boots against pavement, each step carrying the weight of unshakable resolve. The officer noticed it too. His posture stiffened slightly, his head tilting as if his instincts, long dulled by arrogance, were trying to warn him. But he ignored it, dismissing the noise as just another passing stranger. Dina, however, knew better. She forced herself to turn her head, her vision still blurred from pain, but her mind sharpening with something new. Hope. From the darkness beyond the flickering streetlights, a figure emerged, tall, solid, radiating an aura so intense that even the city itself seemed to pause. The officer's smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second. Then he straightened, puffing out his chest, and turned to face the approaching figure. He had faced challengers before. He knew how to handle them. But this was different, because the man stepping into the light wasn't just anyone. It was Chuck Norris. Dina saw him clearly now, and despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the overwhelming fear, she felt something shift inside her, a relief so profound it nearly brought her to tears. Chuck's expression was unreadable, his eyes dark, scanning the scene with the precision of a man who had seen far too much injustice in his lifetime. He took in Dina's battered state, the blood staining her scraped knees, the bruises forming on her wrists. His jaw tightened. The officer, still standing over Dina, scoffed. He didn't recognize Chuck immediately, or if he did, he refused to acknowledge it. That would be his first mistake. Chuck stopped a few feet away, hands resting at his sides, utterly calm. The air between them was charged, a silent battle waged in a single glance. The officer, sensing the shift, decided to take control of the situation. He barked out something, likely an attempt to assert authority, but Chuck didn't react. He simply stood there, his presence alone more powerful than any badge or uniform. Then he took a step forward. And the officer, without realizing it, took a step back. A primal reaction, instinctive, the body recognizing a threat before the mind could rationalize it. Dina saw it. She saw the fear creeping into the officer's stance, saw his bravado waver just slightly. Chuck's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, low, controlled, but behind that control was something dangerous, something unstoppable. The officer hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for his baton, fingers tightening around the handle, ready to remind this stranger who was in charge. That would be his second mistake, because Chuck Norris was faster. The moment the baton was halfway from its holster, Chuck moved. A blur of motion, effortless, precise, lethal. The officer barely registered what had happened before his arm was twisted, the baton ripped from his grasp and tossed aside like a meaningless toy. A sharp, calculated twist sent pain shooting through his wrist, forcing him to his knees with a grunt. Chuck didn't even break a sweat. The officer gasped, shock replacing arrogance. He had underestimated the wrong man. Dina watched, breathless, as Chuck released his grip, letting the officer stumble backward. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The officer, despite the pain, made one last desperate move, reaching for the gun at his hip. That would be his third and final mistake. Chuck's next move was so fast, so impossibly swift that Dina barely saw it happen. 1 second, the officer's hand was on his gun. The next, he was flat on his back, winded, disarmed, and staring up at the sky in pure disbelief. His gun? Now in Chuck Norris's hand. Chuck examined it for a second, then casually ejected the magazine, letting it drop to the ground. The gun followed a moment later, sliding away across the pavement. The officer coughed, scrambling to sit up. His confidence had shattered completely, replaced by something raw and uncertain. Chuck loomed over him, expression still unreadable. Then, for the first time that night, Dina heard fear in the officer's voice, a stammered protest, an attempt to justify. Chuck didn't react. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Dina. The moment their eyes met, she felt an overwhelming wave of security. He crouched beside her, his movements surprisingly gentle, checking her injuries. She winced as he examined her scraped knee, but she didn't pull away. His presence alone was enough to make her feel safe again. Satisfied that she was still conscious and breathing, he stood. Sirens pierced the night, getting closer. More officers. Chuck didn't move. The officer on the ground struggled to his feet, looking desperate, as if trying to decide whether to run or fight. Neither option would save him. As the patrol cars screeched to a halt, red and blue lights flashing, Chuck stepped back, allowing the unfolding chaos to take its course. The other officers jumped out, guns drawn, but the sight before them made them freeze. Their colleague disarmed, a young woman, battered and bleeding. And Chuck Norris standing there like an immovable force of nature. The tension lasted mere seconds before one of the higher-ranking officers barked an order. "Drop your weapon." Chuck merely gestured toward the gun lying harmlessly on the pavement. The officer nearest to the downed man quickly assessed the situation, his face darkening as he took in Dina's condition. Then, without hesitation, he ordered the arrest of his own officer. The fallen man protested, his voice rising in desperation, but no one listened. The cuffs that had been meant for Dina now snapped around his own wrists. Justice in its purest form. Dina let out a shaky breath. Chuck turned back to her. He didn't need to say anything. She understood. She was safe now. Because Chuck Norris had arrived. The red and blue lights bathed the street in an eerie, pulsating glow, casting long, shifting shadows across the pavement. The wail of sirens was deafening, but to Dina it felt distant, like white noise, muffled beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her body ached, bruises forming beneath her skin, her scraped knees still stinging from the rough asphalt. But none of that mattered now. She was no longer alone. Chuck Norris stood beside her, a figure of absolute, unshakable authority. The moment he had arrived, the tide had shifted. The fear, the helplessness, it had all been replaced by something else, something powerful. Justice. The corrupt officer, no longer the unchallenged predator he had been minutes ago, lay sprawled on the pavement, his hands shaking as he cradled his wrist, still in pain from Chuck's earlier counterattack. His uniform, once a symbol of control, now seemed to hang limply on his frame, like a disguise that no longer fit. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was shattered. He had made too many mistakes. And now he was paying for them. The other officers who had arrived on the scene hesitated, their hands still hovering over their holstered weapons as they took in the situation. The sight before them was not what they had expected. Instead of an officer in control and a supposed suspect detained, they saw something far different. One of their own, disarmed, defeated, and undeniably guilty. The highest-ranking officer, a man whose hardened features showed years of experience, stepped forward. His gaze swept over Dina, taking in her injuries, the ripped fabric of her clothes, the scraped skin on her hands and knees. His expression darkened. Then his eyes shifted to Chuck Norris. There was a brief pause, one that carried the weight of unspoken understanding. This was no ordinary civilian standing before them. This was Chuck Norris, and his presence alone spoke louder than any words could. Chuck didn't move. He didn't have to. The corrupt officer scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for support among his colleagues. But none of them came to his defense. He took a step back, then another, his panic growing. "Take his badge," the captain ordered, his voice calm but firm. The words hit the officer like a physical blow. His badge, his authority, his power. Gone. One of the other officers stepped forward hesitantly, reaching for the badge pinned to the disgraced man's chest. For a split second, it seemed like he would resist. His jaw clenched, his fists trembling at his sides. But then, his gaze flickered back to Chuck, and whatever defiance had been left in him crumbled. He let the officer remove the badge, his body sagging slightly as though the weight of his own guilt had finally settled on his shoulders. But it wasn't over yet. "Your weapon," the captain continued. The disgraced officer hesitated again, then slowly reached for his holster. His hands were shaking as he unfastened the strap, pulling out his gun and holding it out. It was taken from him without ceremony, the final piece of his authority stripped away. The cuffs came next. Click. The sound of the metal locking into place echoed through the street. The officer, who had once held all the power, who had laughed as he pushed Dina to the ground, who had taunted her, humiliated her, hurt her, was now the one being restrained. His eyes darted back to Chuck, desperate, pleading, but there was no mercy there, no sympathy, only silent, unwavering judgment. Chuck stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The officer stiffened, instinctively flinching, as if expecting another strike. But Chuck didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. "You made a choice." Chuck's voice was low, measured, a storm beneath the surface. The officer's breath hitched. "You chose to abuse your power," Chuck continued, his words cutting through the night like steel. "You thought no one would stop you." The silence stretched, heavy and damning. "But you were wrong." The officer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet Chuck's stare any longer. Two officers grabbed him by the arms, leading him toward one of the waiting patrol cars. He didn't resist. He knew it was over. As the car door slammed shut behind him, Dina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was done. He was done. For the first time since that nightmare had begun, she felt the weight lifting from her chest. She turned her head slightly, looking up at Chuck. He was still watching the patrol car, his expression unreadable. His fists were still clenched, his stance still tense, as if he was making sure, absolutely sure, that justice had been served. Only when the car began to pull away did he relax. Then he looked at her. Their eyes met, and for the first time since this had all begun, she felt safe. Chuck took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "Are you hurt?" She hesitated, then nodded slightly. A little. That was an understatement, but Chuck knew that. He could see it. Without another word, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not in the way the officer had, not with force or control, but with quiet reassurance. A simple, grounding gesture. Dina closed her eyes for a brief second, letting that feeling sink in. She was safe. She was alive. And thanks to Chuck Norris, she had won. But there was still one last thing left to do. Go home. Together, they turned away from the flashing lights, the echoes of sirens, the weight of everything that had happened. Justice had been served. Now, it was time to heal. The sirens faded into the distance, swallowed by the city's endless hum. The flashing red and blue lights that had once illuminated the darkened street were gone, leaving only a heavy silence in their wake. The night was still again, but it was not the same night that Dina had begun walking home in. The world had shifted. The nightmare had passed, leaving exhaustion in its place. Dina's legs felt unsteady beneath her as the adrenaline began to wear off. The pain from her bruises and scrapes settled in, sharp and pulsing. But more than the physical pain, it was the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on her. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Chuck Norris stood beside her, unmoving. His presence alone was enough to keep her grounded. Even though the immediate danger had passed, he remained alert, scanning the empty street, his sharp eyes missing nothing. His hands rested at his sides, relaxed but ready, always ready. Dina stole a glance at him, studying the calm strength in his face. He had done what no one else could. He had stepped in when no one else had. He had stopped the nightmare before it could get any worse. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Chuck shifted, turning toward her. "Let's go." Dina nodded, and without another word, they started walking. The streets felt different now. The same flickering streetlights still buzzed overhead. The same cracked pavement stretched beneath their feet, but Dina knew she would never look at this path the same way again. As they walked, Chuck's pace was steady, measured, but his attention never wavered. He kept her on the inside of the sidewalk, positioning himself between her and the road, as if even now he was shielding her from the world. The city was quieter at this hour. Storefronts had long since closed, and most of the foot traffic had thinned out. A few cars passed, their headlights cutting through the night, but otherwise it was still. Dina glanced down at her hands. Her knuckles were raw, her fingertips trembling slightly. The reality of everything that had happened was starting to settle into her bones. The fear, the helplessness, the moment she had realized she was alone, trapped. Except she hadn't been alone. Not for long. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to push away the lingering chill that crept up her spine. Chuck must have noticed the tension in her shoulders because he finally broke the silence. "You're safe now." The words were simple, direct, but they carried a weight that settled deep inside her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice just yet. They walked the rest of the way in silence. By the time they reached her house, the tension in her muscles had started to ease. The sight of the familiar porch, the warm glow from the living room window, the distant murmur of the television inside, it was all enough to remind her that she was home. Safe. Chuck stepped up beside her as she reached for the front door. For a moment, she hesitated. The events of the night had left her rattled, and even though she was standing at her own doorstep, part of her still felt like she was trapped in that street, frozen under the weight of a nightmare. Sensing her hesitation, Chuck placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Go inside. Get cleaned up. I'll be right here." Dina swallowed hard, then nodded. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her instantly. the familiar scent of home, wood polish, faint traces of dinner, a hint of fabric softener, wrapped around her like a safety net. It was such a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving night she had just escaped. She didn't realize how much she had needed it. She barely made it to the hallway mirror before she stopped short, catching sight of her reflection. She looked different. Her hair was disheveled, strands falling messily around her face. Her clothes were torn, dust and dirt clinging to the fabric. The bruises were already forming, dark patches blooming across her skin like shadows. Her knees were scraped raw, dried blood crusting around the edges of the cuts. She barely recognized herself. For a moment, she just stood there, staring. Then, with a deep breath, she turned away. She went to the bathroom, washed her hands, cleaned the scrapes on her knees, wincing as the antiseptic stung. She changed into fresh clothes, the soft fabric a stark relief against her bruised skin. The routine, the familiarity of it helped. It brought her back. By the time she stepped back into the living room, Chuck was still there. He was seated at the kitchen table now, his posture as relaxed as ever, but his eyes were watchful. Always watchful. She hesitated, then slowly walked over and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Dina exhaled. "Thank you." Chuck met her gaze. He didn't nod, didn't say, "You're welcome," didn't offer meaningless reassurances. He simply held her stare, his expression calm, steady, because he understood. Some things didn't need to be said. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed between people who had been through something together, something that didn't need to be put into words. After a while, Chuck finally leaned back slightly. "You should rest." Dina nodded. She was exhausted. As she stood, Chuck rose too. He walked toward the door, pausing briefly before glancing back at her. "If you need anything," he said, "you call me." Dina swallowed. Then, with more certainty than before, she nodded. He gave her one last look, then stepped outside. The night air rushed in for a brief moment before the door clicked shut behind him. Dina stood there for a long time, staring at the door. She knew she wouldn't sleep easily tonight. The memories of what had happened would linger in the corners of her mind, waiting for the darkness to settle in before creeping forward again. But she also knew something else. She wasn't alone. And as long as Chuck Norris was in this world, as long as he was watching, protecting, she never would be. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more stories. Watch the next video or check out others on the channel. Share this video with friends.